Hey Grandmasters, it's Mike from the WCA. We're going to take a look at a Week 7 video, and this is a classic game. This is a game that if you're a chess student, regardless of where you're studying chess, in a classroom, in an after-school program, with a private coach, you're going to run across these types of games. It's a game being played by a gentleman named Lewis Paulson, and the black piece is being played by Paul Morphy. And Paul Morphy by now should be familiar with, or to most WCA students. Paul was born in Louisiana and played in the 1800s and was considered at the time to be the best player in the world, an unofficial world champion. And I say unofficial because at that point they hadn't organized world championships yet. But had they done so, Morphy certainly would have been the favorite to win a world championship. Too much to say about his games in such a short amount of time, but what I will point out to you is the use of his entire force. So when his pieces were developed in the games, there was such coordination between the pieces and such dynamic play that he would create that the players in his time, you have to remember these games were played quite a long time ago, they didn't have quite the defensive techniques that they have today. His opponent, Lewis Paulson, was a German player, very strong, has many opening variations named after him. As a matter of fact, the variation of the Sicilian that Russa plays is sometimes begins as a Paulson Sicilian. He was a decent defensive player, kind of ahead of his time in terms of some of the defensive techniques that he had. However, no match for Morphy, as you'll see in this game. So let's get into it, and as we go through, please remember to use your pause button quite a bit. It's important that you pause after any comment or idea that goes by that's tricky for you, number one, and especially if you're learning the squares of the game. We go fast. We do it on purpose. We want you to pick up the entire board, meaning every square, every color, so that when you hear, for example, D4, you know it's a dark square in the middle of the board. H7, light square, top of the board. Right-hand side if you're playing the white pieces. So you should spend a lot of time learning the squares of the game. It's going to help you speak chess language. So as you begin to analyze at a higher level, the words will come out of your mouth much more smoothly, and the chess players listening to you will know exactly the part of the board that you're talking about. Okay, so let's get into the game. It begins as a 4 knights opening. And from the 4 knights, there's a common mistake that's played at the scholastic level. And it's not a tragic mistake, it's not the end of the world, but it has to do with the move bishop to c4. And when you play bishop c4 in a 4 knights position like you see here, it allows your opponent, if they choose to play the move knight takes e4. Now that looks a little bizarre because you can say, hey, white can just take a free knight for a pawn, but it's not for free. Black can get the piece back. So if you're new to this center fork trick, you can pause the video and figure out how black gets his piece back. And everyone else who's been familiarized with this idea should find the move d5. And if you just look at a straight ahead capture, for example, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, the position in terms of material is equal. Black and white have the same amount of material, but there are some key differences here. If you examine the position a little more closely, you'll see, number one, that black has the 2 bishops, and we know the bishop pair can be quite a force if it gets mobilized. And in terms of getting those bishops in the game, you'll notice that both diagonals are already open for those 2 pieces. So black is not going to have to spend a lot of time getting those pieces into play, and will probably have the option of castling on either side of the board. So from the black perspective, that's terrific. I mean, I can get all my pieces in the game and have the option of castling in either direction. You don't get that in most openings. So there's one advantage. There's another. It has to do with the pawn on e5. The pawn on e5 is giving black a lot of space. So the center fork trick basically knocks out white's most advanced pawn. leaving black with the only pawn in the center. And we've talked so much in class this semester about how pawns create space for players. So is black winning in this position? No, but black is slightly better after move 6. And again, that's just not going to happen in most openings. So let's go back for one moment to the initial bishop to c4. Players who have been caught in this before, this center fork trick, they realize that I'm going to give away one of my pieces after I take their knight. I know I'm going to have to give a piece back. So why don't I give it away first and play a move like bishop takes f7? It seems better because after the king takes, now I get their piece. Here comes d5, and I might be able to play a move like knight from e to g5, check. And isn't this good for white? Well, on the surface it looks great because the black king is most likely going to tuck himself into g8, and white should feel proud about black's king's position. However, chess is not always so simple. Black is actually better in this position, and you can't judge the position just on the fact that the black king is on g8 and the rook on h8 is not working. That's a temporary problem that black can get out of. Remember, they can always move a pawn and chase that knight away. The rook in the corner will eventually find its way out, but let's look at the rest of black's position. Look at the two bishops again. Just like we saw in the last example, black has the bishop pair, and again, no trouble getting those pieces in the game. There's an additional bonus. Instead of having one center pawn, black actually has the pawn duo with pawns on d5 and e5 that controls an enormous amount of space, and more importantly, controls key squares in white's position. When you add all of that up, this is a terrific position for black. You may seem a little uncomfortable up there, but remember, as we keep talking about being flexible as a chess player, there is no rule that says you have to have a castled king. In most positions, you're going to castle, and that's going to help your rook get in the game. But if something odd happens or tactical, you have to change your thinking according to the new position that's in front of you. So Paulsen, back to the four knights position, avoids all of this and plays bishop to b5, which is the main move. And Morphy, funny enough, says to Paulsen, okay, go for the center fork trick, which he can. He can go for, and if he did, Morphy could continue this way. I'm sorry, after d4, perhaps bishop to d6, pawn takes, bishop takes, and oddly enough, in this version of the center fork trick, white doesn't get quite the same advantage that black had before, and one of the reasons for that is the white bishop that's there on b5. It's kind of out there all by itself, and in this particular line, for example, after both kings castle, that bishop on b5 tends to get attacked with pawns, and it helps black reestablish or get their fair share of the center. So it's not winning for either side. It's still the same center fork trick, but it doesn't have quite the same bite it had in the other example that we showed you. So Paulsen just castles. And, you know, I certainly wasn't around back in that day, and I think if you ask another master, or a master in this position, they might say that Paulsen also castled because before he gets into any tactical skirmish or fight with Morphy, it feels right to have your king tucked away. Remember, Morphy was a fierce attacker, and I think a lot of these guys back in the day felt secure fighting him with their king's castle. So I think that might be a smaller reason why he tucked his king away before beginning a battle. So in the game, Morphy just follows suits and castles, and Morphy is now hit with the center fork trick. And the cool thing about chess, and this is something that Rusa constantly reminds our students about, please don't forget, chess is not checkers. We all like to play checkers. However, there's, in most versions of checkers, when somebody offers you one, you have to take it. In chess, there is no law or rule that says you have to take the knight on e5. So Morphy temporarily gives up the pawn in return for the move rook e8. So now there are 4 black pieces that are kind of working in the position. Perhaps Paulsen could have gone back, given the pawn back in the center. You may have had something that looked like this, d3 chasing the rook back home, most likely back home. And looks like a fairly even position, and white probably has the same opening advantage that they would have in most of these structures. But Paulsen, back here after rook e8, decides to trade off the knight. Now he's up a pawn, but the question is, after making this trade, is he going to be able to keep it? Now comes decision time. You're going to take the knight, but if you look closely, you'll see that you have 2 different pawns that can take it. The pawn on b7, the pawn on d7. So again, make sure if you're one of the newer players that you're pausing this video and finding these squares. In most cases, when you have a choice of which way to capture with a pawn, you take with the pawn that brings it closer to the center. It makes the pawn stronger. However, in most opening positions, and again, this is not a rule that is solid. This is a rule that is most of the time. It's more, we call these like a rule of thumb or a basic idea. When you're in an opening, many times, it helps you to take with the pawn away from the center. And you can stop the video and figure out why. Looking at the position after you take with the d-pawn, you'll notice you open the diagonal for black's dark squared bishop. It's extremely important to get the pieces active as quickly as possible in the opening, and that's why Morphy took away from the center. You'll also notice that the pawn attacks the bishop on b5, so Morphy's going to gain a little bit of time here. Well, what to do with the bishop? Well, he puts it on c4, and by putting it on c4, he is setting a small trap. By doing so, he's kind of inviting Morphy to get his pawn back right away. But that wouldn't be good. If you look at the bishop on c4, when Paulsen puts it there, taking on e4 would allow this move, bishop takes pawn. And if the king recaptures, then the knight takes back, and in this position we're looking at white still being up a pawn and black not being able to take that knight. And it looks like you can, but if you take here, spot the move that wins some material for white. So obviously you have to get a piece back, but how? Well, the move is queen f3 check, and queen f3 attacks the king and the rook at the same time. So in this position, white is going to win an exchange, and this is really good for the white pieces. So going back to this position, when Paulsen had the choice of where to put the bishop, bishop to c4 is a nice starting point because it does set that little trap. Now he could have moved it to d3, but that looks funny, and it should look funny to most of you. In king pawn openings, we very rarely block our queen's pawn. Here, I'll show you that highlighted. If you block that pawn, it's going to take a while for your c1 bishop to get into the game. But oddly enough, if you put this on most computers, you'll find that white is not really doing that badly here. But as a chess player, as a human over the board, very difficult to block in your pieces. So Paulsen chooses the move bishop to c4. Morphy is never going to give him a chance to be comfortable and to get his pieces out. So he plays the move pawn to b5. Pawn to b5 basically will gain a little bit of space, but more importantly, it's going to ask Paulsen, well, what do you do with the bishop? Which diagonal do you keep it on? Playing bishop to b3, which looks natural, keeping it on the same line as the king, could run into the move bishop to g4. And after bishop to g4, you can't block it with a pawn because your pawn is pinned, bishop on c5. And again, I'll keep reminding you, please stop the video as many times as it takes to learn the squares. So pretty much, you're either going to take your knight and go backwards, or you're going to move your queen. And, you know, for example, what if that pawn keeps marching and comes to b4, and you have to play a move like knight d1? Just throwing these moves out here. Now after knight e4, don't really like the look of white's pieces. Everything is pushed back. Black has more space, and I certainly can't imagine Paulsen wanted to play this position. So when his bishop was attacked with b5, he put it on e2, which cuts off any ideas of the black bishop coming to that diagonal. Well, now it's safe to take the pawn back, which Paulsen does, and Morphy does, and Paulsen captures, rook captures, and Paulsen improves his bishop by playing bishop to f3. And bishop f3 not only attacks the rook, but if we highlight some squares for you, you're going to see that it also puts pressure on that pawn and the whole diagonal in general. So Morphy decides, oh, I'm not going to give you the pawn, and plays rook to e6. But again, Morphy, the more you learn about his games, you're going to see that almost all of his moves in the middle game were multi-purpose. At least when he had the opportunity, he got the most out of his moves. That's not just a defensive move. It actually leaves the rook in an offensive posture, or in an offensive stance. Let's use these same words as if we were athletes. That rook on e6, while it is defending the pawn, can also, let's show you some highlights here, swing over. And when rooks lift themselves off the back row, and they have the ability to now go left or right, they can become real attacking forces. Okay, now Paulsen plays the move c3. And after c3, a signal should go off in your head and say, like, why would a grandmaster play a move c3 in this position? Well, what square does that pawn support? Well, it's two of them, actually. The b4 square and the d4 square. And Paulsen, if allowed, is going to push his center pawn up, attack the black bishop, get his dark squared bishop out, and have a pretty good position. Except, let's make another highlight. When Paulsen played pawn c3, he really weakened the d3 square. And Morphy, and it's a pretty amazing move to find, says, well, I'm not going to let you play d4. So can you figure out what he played here? He played queen d3. And at first glance, that's a pretty funny looking move, to have your queen right in the middle of your opponent's position. But after you examine the position a little more closely, you'll see it's not so easy to get that queen out of there. And by putting the queen on d3, you're really cramping all of white's pieces. Now in this position, Paulsen probably should have immediately went about trying to challenge the black pieces. For example, let's look what happens if there are some trades here, and say bishop d7 the way Morphy played in the game. White could actually play a move like queen f1. It may look a little passive, but white doesn't really mind trading into an endgame, because the more these pieces come off the board, for example, rook e8, let's look at, I don't know, d4 attacking the bishop, bishop to d6. White has a little structural advantage. Their pawn structure's slightly better. Position is level, and really no forced win for either side. It's now what we say is a game, but white is at least free and the pieces are able to come out. So challenging that piece immediately from this position, playing the move rook e1, may have given him some freedom and taken away some of the force that Morphy eventually builds up. So instead, he plays a forcing move, he attacks the bishop, and this is a great time to ask students rated between 1,000 or 1,200, somewhere in that range, what do you do with the bishop? So if you're under 1,000, then we're happy that you just move it anywhere. Just, don't get it taken, because getting your rating over 1,000 you can do pretty much by just not hanging pieces. Once you start getting over and getting into different levels, then you have to be a little more savvy and careful what you do when you're attacked. So for example, you could play the move bishop f8, and that little maneuver sometimes is a terrific move. It gets in there, it supports the king, maybe you can fee and shadow the bishop later, but in this position, do you really need to support the black king? Well, the answer to that question is no, because back here, the white pieces aren't out at all, so why protect our king if it's not necessary? So Morphy chooses to keep the king under attack. So his bishop, by backing up to b6, is on direct line with the white king. Well, he continues on, pressing on the queen side. And again, perhaps rook e1 would give him a chance to relieve that bind that he's in. But Paulsen pressed on with a4, and he's got a little bit of a trap here. So you have to be careful not to develop your pieces blindly, like bishop to d7 would run into pawn a5, and you just lost the piece. So after a4, Morphy takes. When he takes, white takes back with the queen, trying to get the pieces into the battle, and the queen now attacks the c6 square for the second time. Don't forget about white's bishop on f3. So Morphy develops the bishop to d7, holds the c6 pawn, and more importantly, allows the rook up in the corner, the rook on a8, to swing into the game. Here is where we would stop our students, and now we'll start talking to the more advanced students, the 4 p.m. class, and we would say it's time that in your own games that you realize that if you're slightly worse, or if there's some problem, you have to address the problem as quickly as possible. So in this position, maybe white should have asked, what's my biggest challenge? And the answer to that question would have been, my pieces are still tied up and not coordinated. Perhaps he could have offered a trade in this position with queen a6 right away. Just try to get a trade, get the queens off the board. And it's something that he tried to do, but it took 2 moves instead of 1. So let's show you what he did. He played rook a2 in this position. Let's go back for one moment. This is Morphy's last move, bishop to d7. And again, we're asking players with the white pieces to address their biggest problem. And it's the fact that the black queen is completely dominating the position and our pieces are cramped. So what kind of move could we play to try to solve both problems? Queen a6 pretty much addresses the problem in one move. What Paulsen did was he played rook a2. And his idea was to put the queen on c2 perhaps and get the queen out that way. However, it gives Morphy time to bring his last piece into the game, and he plays rook a to e8. And by doing so, we'll highlight that arrow, takes complete control of the e-file. Now take a moment to compare the 2 rooks. This is something we used to do in the classroom when chess was part of the curriculum. Even kids who weren't experienced chess players could always participate in these conversations. We would do simple comparisons. Compare the 2 queens. Do you think the black queen is doing more work? If so, why? And you can have the conversation with yourself. Is the white queen well placed? Compare the 2 black bishops to the 2 white bishops. There's no imbalance in minor pieces. It's not like bishop versus knight or dark squared bishop versus light squared bishop. Each team has a bishop pair. Well, what are they doing? Look at things like pawn structure. Whose pawn structure do you like better? And then finally look at something like king safety. Well, if we had the conversation about the rooks, I think it would be pretty clear whose rooks were doing the most work. Okay, a little trap here as well. If Paulsen plays his queen to c2 idea, he gets mated in 2 moves. So stop the video, make sure you find the mate in 2. And that would begin with a very cool move, queen takes rook. Once the king takes back, which is forced, that exposes the power of the 2 rooks on the open file. and black mates white in one move. So back in this position, queen c2 was now put on hold. So now Paulsen tries the queen a6 idea. And again, as I mentioned before, it took him 2 moves to play this idea instead of 1. When you're playing a guy like Paul Morphy, you don't always have the luxury of taking your time. Morphy was a master of doing things efficiently, quickly, and with the most force possible. Okay, well, now it's time to take a look at a couple of ideas. If I asked you to look at this sacrifice, queen takes f3, I would ask you to make that sacrifice based on the highlighted pieces that you see on the left. Going back, if I take the highlights off and then put them on, try to figure out why a coach or anyone showing a game like this would highlight the 3 pieces on the left-hand side of the board, because Morphy actually sacrificed his queen in this position. So after a pause, the reason they're highlighted is those are 3 very powerful pieces that are in no position to defend the white king. So because they're offside and attacking the queen side of the board, Morphy realized that if I take the bishop and open up the king, he'll have no defenders to help, which is absolutely true. Now let me highlight another set of pieces for you. Same move, queen takes f3. Wow, look at those arrows. After the queen takes on f3, every one of those highlighted pieces are now in position to attack the king. There are the defenders highlighted, completely out of play, and here are the attackers. Once you start picking up these little ideas, then after moves like queen a6, you should then say, wow, I see pieces out of play. What was I taught to do? Well, strike, attack, sacrifice, open the game up, even if it means using the queen. You just have to make sure you have enough firepower. Well, Morphy calculated that he did. So he sacrificed the queen. If you don't take the queen, you're going to be down a piece, which is against Morphy the same as resigning. You might as well take the queen. And what would your move be here? You just gave up a whole queen. Well, try to do some coordinating with your pieces. Rook g6 check. Beautiful move. King forced to go into the center. And now Morphy threatens mate. Bishop h3 is threatening a checkmate here. And if you're not careful, that bishop is going to come in there, check you, and you could get mated. You either have to cover that square, or you're going to need to make an escape square for your king. For example, if you immediately challenge the square, now you get mated. And there's more than one version to this mate. It's mate in 3. Rook takes pawn, rook, check. King must take. Rook e1. Queen f1, only move. Rook takes queen, mate. So after the immediate challenge, rook g1, we see that by taking the rook, we have a forced mate. I'll leave you with a question. Can you mate the king starting with bishop to g2 check? I'm not going to show you with the highlights. Find the squares, find the piece. If the black bishop goes to g2 and checks the king, can you mate white? Okay, so after bishop h3, Paulsen saw the threat and decided to give his king some space. Morphy continues with bishop g2 check. King g1 is forced. Bishop takes f3 check. That's a discovered check. There's a rook up there on g6. King f1. And here Morphy made a slight mistake. He could have checkmated a little bit faster in this position or put more pressure on white with the move rook g2, which is very, very strong. Although the move that he picked is really just as good. He chose bishop to g2, which is going to push the king back into the corner of the board. You'll notice he has to go underneath the bishop. So after taking the pawn on f3, now the bishop goes to h3 with another discovered check. king goes to h1, and he just keeps on coming with the threats. So you can continue checking on g2 with the bishop and force a draw, but Morphy decides to take on f2, and now bishop g2 would be checkmate. Really no way to stop that other than giving up your queen, which he had to do. You have to cover the g2 square. So he covers it with f1. Morphy gets his material back. Rook takes. And this is the kind of position where players can easily fumble and lose the thread, and even lose a game like this with the black pieces. Morphy continued by putting the most pressure on white's position. So if you had black, what would you play? Well, the move rook e2. Rooks belong on the 7th rank. Very powerful move. Rook e2 also stops white from doing something they want to do. They clearly want to get their dark squared bishop into the game. By playing rook e2, you just pin the pawn on d2. So you see the white rook on the left-hand side of the video. Now look at the pawn on d2. There's a pawn between both rooks, the black rook and the white rook. That pawn is now pinned. If it moves, you lose a rook on a2. So Paulson gets the rook back in the game by moving it to a1, and then again, go over master games and you'll learn so many attacking ideas. Look for targets. Morphy plays rook h6, which is lined up with the other rook on e2. So the only thing in between that square is his own bishop. Paulson pushes to d4, and in this position, Morphy plays one move. Paulson has to resign. Bishop e2. And there's too much pressure coming down that h-file toward that h-pawn. If you don't take the bishop, the pawn is going to get captured on h2 regardless. Your position is so bad. If you do take it, there's a forced mate in 2. So let's see if you can find it. Pause your video. It's rook on h takes, king g1, rook e to g2 mate. Absolutely terrific game. It's a classic, and again, as we start to recommend some books and other videos and things for you over time, you're going to come across this game again. So save it and make sure you come back to it more than once. Okay? We'll see everybody Sunday. Give us a call or an email if you have any questions.